Join us as we listen closely to voices that still echo from our nation's past. Distant, even obscure, but all the more exciting for that mystery. It's where fascinating women discuss fascinating women's histories. I'm Tzipora Weinberg, and this is Veiled Reference. Let's take a deep dive into pockets of history preserved in our Torah sources. With each episode, we'll travel back in time to discover and recover stories of women who might have otherwise been lost to us. Piecing together the tales of these women of old can help us to understand periods of time that we've only hazily conceived of before. It's time to let these women's voices rise to the surface through the sources left to us, and to learn about the lives they led, and maybe draw inspiration and strength to empower each one of us on our own journeys.
Imagine having an absolutely insatiable hunger for knowledge. Just a mind that constantly races, constantly questions, and is always trying to connect the dots. And now imagine you're placed right in the epicenter of the greatest intellectual hub of your era, the absolute midpoint of the scholarly Torah universe. You're close enough to hear all the brilliant debates echoing down the hall, but you're always a step away from joining the conversation. And it's exactly that specific kind of intellectual isolation that we're exploring right now. So welcome, if you're joining us. Today's podcast centers on Rebbetzin Rayna Basia Berlin, the wife of the Netziv, Reb Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. Rebbetzin Berlin, a unique figure, the daughter and granddaughter of Torah giants. Rayna Basia aroused enormous curiosity, and she is a personality that has garnered a great deal of attention, and about whom much is recorded and reflected in academic scholarship. To speak about Rayna Basia is to speak about the Netziv. To speak about the Netziv is to speak about the Yeshiva of Volozhiner. And as we hit the airwaves today, right before Shavuos, Chag Matan Torah, Taf Shin Pei Vav, what could be more relevant than to speak about the greatest center of Torah learning, Volozhiner, the mother of all yeshivos? Because the concept of yeshiva has accompanied our people throughout the generations, all the way back to the times of the Avos, who studied at Yeshivas Shem Va'ever. As Chazal explained so evocatively in Yuma Daf Chavches, the Amar Rabbi Chama B'Rabbi Chanina, Mimehen shel avosenu lo parsha yeshiva mehem. From the days of our ancestors, never did the yeshiva depart from them. Hayu b'Mitzrayim, yeshiva imahem. Hayu b'Midbar, yeshiva imahem. Avram Avinu zakein v'yoshev b'yeshiva. Yitzchak Avinu zakein v'yoshev b'yeshiva haya. Yaakov Avinu zakein, yoshev v'yeshiva haya. When they were in Egypt, the yeshiva was with them. In the wilderness, the yeshiva was with them. Avraham in his old age sat in yeshiva. Yitzchak, our father, old and sitting in the yeshiva. And the same with Yaakov Avinu. Yeshivos prevailed throughout as the system of Torah's transmission from generation to generation. The form of the yeshiva, the roles of those who taught within it, the curriculum, the methods of study, all of these morphed according to geographic and historical limitations. But one unifying thread ran through them across time and space, the aspiration to engage with Torah and its commandments at a remove from the bustle and distractions of the surrounding world. Up until this very moment, the yeshiva remains a way of life that expresses the sanctity of the spirit and the dedication to what is most essential. So as for the mother of all yeshivos, the Volozhiner yeshiva, it was called that, Eim HaYeshivos, not because it was the first, but because it became the symbol and model that all subsequent yeshivas sought to emulate. Around the year 1802, Taf Kuf Samach Beis, Rav Chaim, the greatest Talmud of the Vilna Gaon, established a yeshiva in the small town of Volozhiner, situated on the main road between Vilna and Minsk. Rav Chaim founded the yeshiva with a crystal clear perspective on the impact, the centrality of Torah study. In his major work, Nefesh HaChaim, Rav Chaim ensconces his worldview that learning Torah sustains the universe, not metaphorically, but literally. Before Volozhin, yeshivas had almost always been community projects, rooted in a specific town, funded by its residents, and led by the local Rav. Students came to learn under their Rav, to serve alongside him, and to prepare themselves for roles in Rabbanos. These yeshivos were small, rarely more than a few dozen students. They didn't necessarily all study even in the same room or from the same text, and there was no fixed daily schedule that held it all together. But what Rav Chaim founded was something entirely different. His yeshiva would belong to no single community. It would stand independent, sustained by a network of emissaries that he dispatched to every corner of the Russian Empire to raise funds on its behalf. And its guiding spirit was Torah lishma, Torah for its own sake, not Torah as preparation for a career, but Torah study as an end in itself. The very form of learning was transformed. Talmidim gathered in one great hall. They followed a shared daily schedule, davened together, learned the same Masechta, and flowing through it all was a continuous stream of teaching from the Rosh Yeshiva himself. From across the empire, hundreds of young men made the journey to Volozhin. Legends spread of the extraordinary diligence and love of Torah that filled its walls, and a famous poet pondered, Hakan beis hayotzer lenishmas ha'uma. Is this it, the workshop that crafts the nation's soul? Volozhin became the model, the template, and the symbol for every yeshiva that came after it. Others refined it, developed it, gave it new forms in new places. But Volozhin was the foundation. Today, when dominant yeshivas are woven so deeply into the fabric of our lives, it can be difficult to imagine the world that came before. But it was Rav Chaim of Volozhin who planted the roots, and from those roots grew a revolution across the Jewish people. When Rav Chaim was nifter in 1821, his son, the Gaon Rav Yitzchok, succeeded him at Volozhin's helm. In 1849, after Rav Yitzchok Volozhiner passed away, two sons-in-law took his place. Rav Eliezer Yitzchok Fried, who had married his daughter Rivka, was designated as Rosh Yeshiva, and the younger son-in-law, Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who had married Rayna Basia, became the Sgan Rosh Yeshiva. Tragically, Rav Eliezer Yitzchok did not live long. He passed away just 4 years later. The younger son-in-law, the Netziv, found himself, in a turn of events no one had anticipated, as Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin. There are many stories and traditions about the Netziv in his youth. The famed Yerushalmi Maggid Rav Shalom Shwadron related that as a child, the Netziv struggled with his studies, and his father considered sending him to learn a trade. The young boy wept at length until his parents relented and allowed him to continue in the world of Torah study. His son, Rav Meir Bar Ilan, wrote that even during his years in Volozhin and even after his marriage, the Netziv's particular greatness was not widely recognized, owing to his great modesty. There were those who questioned his capacity to lead the yeshiva. But the Netziv rose to the challenge and proved beyond any doubt that he was the best suited, most capable leader the yeshiva could have. He earned acclaim and fame as one of the greatest and most important rabbinical authorities in Russia and Lithuania. He authored works of great significance, and under his leadership, the yeshiva reached its peak with an enrollment that jumped from 100 to over 500 Talmidim. But our story, as we said, is about the Netziv's wife, Rebbetzin Rayna Basia. She was positioned at the very heart of the Litvish yeshiva world, herself a scion of the Lithuanian rabbinic aristocracy, daughter of Rav Yitzchok, granddaughter of Rav Chaim, and wife of the Netziv. In later generations, she would become the grandmother of Rav Chaim Soloveitchik and the ancestress of the entire Brisker dynasty. Her husband served as Rosh Yeshiva of the most important yeshiva in the Jewish world, Volozhin, the center and joy of his existence, and under his leadership it achieved its fullest glory. The Volozhin of Rayna Basia's era was the greatest Torah center of the age, a magnet drawing the finest Torah scholars from across the Russian-Lithuanian study sphere. About 20 years into the tenure of the Netziv, around 1873, a very young man named Baruch Epstein arrived to study at the yeshiva. Baruch was the son of Rav Michal Epstein of Novardok, the celebrated author of the Aruch HaShulchan. He was also the Netziv's nephew, as his father was married to the Netziv's sister. It is no surprise, then, that his uncle the Netziv and his aunt Rebbetzin Rayna Basia opened the doors of their home to the young man and drew him close. Rav Baruch Epstein never held an official position in Rabbanus, but over the course of his life, he authored a number of books while working as an accountant and bank manager. The best known of these is Torah Temima, or mit Nyantifte genommen, Chamisha Chumshei Torah im Chamesh Megillos, mi Torah Shebechsav im Torah Sheba'al Peh. As you might be able to tell from that title alone, Rav Epstein's works are characterized by intellectual prowess, though they have also attracted scholarly criticism, which we will not enter into here. In 1928, Rav Epstein published a substantial memoir entitled Makar Baruch. The scope of the book in its 4 volumes encompasses an entire world. The history of my ancestors' lives and my own life, together with my recollections of the previous generation, of its rabbanim and scholars, its writers and preachers, its community leaders and men of means, the state of Torah and wisdom, and the life of the nation as a whole. The book contains an enormous number of anecdotes and personal descriptions, and since its publication has been reprinted only a handful of times, yet many of its hundreds of stories have become classics of Jewish rabbinic literature. The 4th volume of Makar Baruch contains descriptions from Rav Epstein's youthful years as a student in Volozhin, and he speaks at length and in admiration of his great-uncle the Netziv, in whose home he was a frequent and welcome guest, often dining at his table on Shabbos and Chag. But he also recorded his conversations with Rebbetzin Rayna Basia, which he says took place during that same period while he was still a young student at the Volozhiner Yeshiva. As part of his memoirs about his uncle, Rav Baruch dedicated a special chapter, volume 4, chapter 46, entitled Chachmas Nashim, the wisdom of women, to the Netziv's wife, his aunt Rebbetzin Rayna Basia. It is a particularly remarkable chapter, consisting primarily of theological and philosophical debates between the young Baruch Epstein and his aunt. Rav Baruch conveys these debates, writing his memoirs decades after the fact with astonishing precision. From his account, there emerges a figure of exceptional intellectual intensity, a figure whom recent scholars have read as a kind of proto-feminist voice, a Rebbetzin who was deeply wounded by her status and her gender. Rav Baruch begins with a description of the Netziv's straitened financial circumstances. His salary was small and insufficient, and there was really no one to look after his needs adequately. Because his first wife, Rebbetzin Rayna Basia, was a righteous and wise woman, modest, extraordinarily learned, of the caliber, he writes, of the finest men, and she certainly cared deeply about her husband's health and well-being. But in practice, she was unable to oversee the management of the household and its provisions because she was, quote, weak and of fragile nerves, barely able to maintain herself in her own body as long as her soul remained within her, end quote. Rav Baruch portrays a physically frail, exhausted, and deeply sensitive woman, someone who has simply lacked the capacity of a Baalas Habayis. So what does a weak woman do? A woman who finds it difficult to respond robustly to life's daily demands? She sits and learns. Rayna Basia's way, according to Rav Baruch, was always to sit beside the winter stove in the dining room, even in summer, with a table of books spread before her. Her book list will astound you. Chumash, Mishnah, Ein Yaakov, various Midrashim, Menoras HaMa'ar, Kav HaYashar, Tzemach David, Shevet Yehuda, and many more books of this nature and volumes of Agada. All of her attention, all of her focus, with every sense and feeling and emotion within the books. According to his account, Rayna Basia barely moved from those books, and whatever concerned the running of the household, she scarcely attended to at all. Rayna Basia was immersed in study, but also miserable. She complained often, and her complaints, strikingly, were not about her health, but about the status of women in Judaism. Rav Baruch describes hearing her lament more than once, low, bitter, inconsolable. She grieved over what women had been denied: tefillin, tzitzis, sukkah, lulav, and so many mitzvos besides. Her words were saturated with suppressed frustration, a silent protest, a spiritual jealousy of men who carried 248 mitzvos aseh, while women, oppressed and disgraced, had been given only 3. But what pained Rayna Basia most was what she felt was the degradation of women's honor and the lowering of their worth, the prohibition against teaching women Torah. If Chava had been cursed with 10 curses, she told the young Baruch, this curse surpassed them all combined. There was no end to the sorrow. By Reb Baruch's account, this subject took on a permanent presence at the table, her deep, unresolved, inner pain. And then Reb Baruch begins to describe a series of charged debates and confrontations between the two of them. The first thing he tried to do in the face of Rayna Basia's proclamations of grievance was to blame the victim. It's not the men's fault that women aren't allowed to learn. Avos de Rabbi Nassan ruled that Torah may only be taught to the humble. And the Talmud Yerushalmi states that women are boastful and ba'alos gava. Case closed. Rayna Basia was taken aback. Then she turned on him. Have you already finished the entire Talmud Bavli that now you're bringing proofs from Yerushalmi? He admitted he hadn't actually seen the passage himself. She rebuked him for failing to credit his source and then demanded he show her the Avos de Rabbi Nassan directly. He did and walked straight into her trap. The text read, Beis Shammai says one may only teach the humble. Al yishne adam ela lemishu hu chacham ve'anav uben avos ve'ashir. Ubeis Hillel omrim l'chal adam yishne. Shaharbe poshim hayu bahem b'Yisrael v'niskarvu l'talmud Torah v'yatzu mehem tzadikim chasidim uksherim. But Beis Hillel says you're supposed to teach everybody because there are many sinners amongst Bnei Yisrael who drew close to Torah and became righteous, pious, and worthy. Rayna Basia raised her voice in fury. How could you bring me a proof from Beis Shammai? Every child knows halacha kehillel. Reb Baruch tried to recover. Rayna Basia savored her victory. She pressed on. She cited women renowned as Torah scholars, Bruria, Yelsa, and others. What was wrong with their Torah wisdom, she asked. Reb Baruch countered that Bruria herself had ultimately fallen, disputing Chazal's teachings that women's minds are capricious, and in the end proved it true. Rayna Basia, familiar with these proofs, was unmoved. Did Chachamim hold all men responsible for Acher, who turned to heresy? She asked. And as for Bruria, she hadn't erred in her assessment of women as kalos da'as. She simply hadn't believed the premise to begin with. In one riveting passage, Rav Baruch recounts a list of learned women he shared with Rayna Basia to prove that there were many women who achieved high levels of Torah learning. Rav Baruch refers to Glickel as Harabanis Be'ir Bayersdorf, and among Dona Grazia Aguilar, and others, we find Le'esa Achrona Ha'isha Emma Lazarus, who translated the poetry of Heine into English. We cannot reproduce the full exchange here, but the spirit of their conversation is clear. Rayna Basia refused with every fiber of her being to accept the inferior status of women, and felt it most acutely in the prohibition on Torah study. What she could not bear, what was simply inconceivable to her, was this, that any ignoramus, any man who in ordinary life wouldn't even dare to enter her home without humbly asking permission, could stand before her in pride and recite in a loud voice, Baruch Shelo Asani Isha. And she was expected to answer, Amen. But the most dramatic moment was still to come, and it is this episode that stands at the center of our podcast today. For it is precisely this story that undermines Reb Baruch's credibility and calls the entire account into question. One day, according to Reb Baruch, Rayna Basia greeted him with uncharacteristic excitement. She held out a book to him, turned to the right page, and placed it before him to read. Reb Baruch understood that she had lain in wait for him with this passage ready at her fingertips. she had found something that confirmed her views. The book, as Reb Baruch later revealed, was Ma'ayan Ganim by the Italian Rav Shmuel Archivolti. Reb Baruch describes it as a book of responsa and letters, Shilas Utshuvas, printed in Venice in the year 1553 and extremely rare. The passage that so delighted Rayna Basia reads as follows, a letter from the author to a certain wise woman. In the course of the letter, the Rav writes regarding women's Torah study, and that which sages have decried a daughter's study vain must needs apply when she is young, but then must she abstain. Since most women are flighty and do not in logic train, they dabble but in trifles, swift and oft do they complain. But those few who discern themselves and choose to rise above and blaze their gaze on God's own work with purpose and with love, it is they that with their heads held high on God's own mountain rise. And each one of our sages must their efforts recognize, to praise them, to raise them, exalt them to the skies, to bolster arms and gird them as they reach the fairest climes. For from them Torah will come forth as in the best of times, and men submerged in pleasures, with indulgences replete, will learn from their example, and their true duties complete. May you find your way in this golden task. Heaven help your goal to meet. Reb Baruch Epstein describes the scene. When I had finished reading, she said to me, in my opinion, each and every one of these words deserves to be set in gold, like precious stones and pearls. And the whole book is like bands of silver. And what do you say to them? The young Baruch refused to join the party. He replied carefully, the Italian Rav's words were beautiful, even precious, but they lacked genuine legal authority. One cannot nullify an explicit Talmudic prohibition on the strength of elegant sentiments. Rayna Basia erupted. Of this author it is rightly said, a good man among 1,000 I have found. Adam echad me'elef matzasi. And you are mean-spirited like all men. She turned her face from him and fixed her eyes on the book before her. Rav Baruch left rebuked and ashamed. Years later, Rav Baruch Epstein reflected with guilt. Why hadn't he simply stayed silent? Rayna Basia would have taken his silence as acquiescence, and her rare, fleeting moment of happiness would have been complete. Baruch appeared to have learned his lesson. He recounts that once, on the evening after Tzom Gedalia, Rebbetzin Rayna Basia invited him to the meal that broke the fast. On that occasion, she shared with him with evident satisfaction a discovery. There had been, in fact, Rabbanim who shared in women's pain over the denial of Torah study, and not only permitted women to study, but actually obligated their fathers to teach them. This was the position of Ben Azai, who stated a man is obligated to teach his daughter Torah. Rav Baruch himself privately believed that Ben Azai's ruling was not mentioned in a context flattering to women. But this time, he held his tongue and stayed silent, letting her understand that he was granting legitimacy to her words. But the silence weighed on him. Upon leaving the house together with a friend, Baruch quipped to his companion that one could well understand why Ben Azai had refused to marry throughout his entire life. If in his view a woman was obligated to learn Torah, then any wife he took would be a Talmidah Chachama, and Ben Azai apparently concluded it was better not to marry at all than to marry a learned Rebbetzin. It was a sharp and painful jab. In the tense days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, Baruch continued to visit the Netziv's home each day as he usually did. But now Rebbetzin Rayna Basia ignored him completely. She neither spoke to him nor asked after his welfare as she had always done. Baruch in his innocence assumed that she was simply withdrawing into the solemn spirit of the Yamim Noraim. But on Erev Yom Kippur, after the pre-fast meal at which he was again a guest at her table, Rebbetzin Rayna Basia called him over to her usual place near her Sfarim and said to him passionately, "You're lucky that today is Erev Yom Kippur, a day on which it is an obligation and a mitzvah to forgive whatever wrong and pain lies between one person and another. And because you are dear to me, I forgive you completely for the harsh words you said." Baruch was stunned. He had no idea what she meant. she let him understand that his friend had reported his words back to her. Rebbetzin Rayna Basia forgave him, but a tense and oppressive silence settled between them. For several months he felt chastened, waiting for the right moment to make amends. When at last Rebbetzin Rayna Basia returned to the subject, Baruch arrived prepared. This time, he came with full and detailed arguments. The obligation of Torah study, he explained, carries an immense burden. It demands total devotion, like the demands of warfare. Just as women are not conscripted into an army, so too women are exempt from Torah study. Chazal, he mentioned, took pity on women and their strength. And if both husband and wife devote themselves completely to Torah, who would care for the family and the children? The world itself would be desolate with no one to nurture it. As Baruch describes it, this time his presentation had an effect. When he finished, the Rebbetzin reflected for a long while, and at last, in a response that carried the anguish of final resignation, she said, "What can be done? Yes, thus it is. Turn to the right, turn to the left. In the end, it is for us oppressed and disgraced women to bend our heads beneath our evil fortune. Righteous are you, Hashem, for all that has been decreed concerning us. Your Torah is certainly true, and your judgments are of massive depth. There is no speech, nor are there words. Baruch atah sha'asani kirtzono." And then she turned to him and said, "Just as everything has an end and a limit, so let there come an end and a limit to this painful matter." From that time on, she never spoke with him on this subject again. This is a wonderful story. The problem is that it never happened. The figure of Rayna Basia has aroused great interest among scholars. Her anguished and tormented voice at times sounds like a fierce proto-feminist cry from within the heart of the Russian Empire, only in the language of 150 years ago. The only problem is that no independent documentation of any of this survives. The sole source is Makar Baruch, and that source is, to put it gently, somewhat problematic. In 1928, more than 50 years after these events are said to have taken place, Rav Baruch Epstein published his book, and in it, as we noted, an apparently meticulous record of those conversations, which have understandably attracted a great deal of attention. We saw how Rebbetzin Rayna Basia cited with joy and excitement from the book Ma'ayan Ganim by Rav Shmuel Arkivolti. Rav Shmuel Arkivolti lived most of his life in Padua, where he served as Rosh Yeshiva, community secretary, and head of the rabbinical court. He died in 1611. His book, Ma'ayan Ganim, was printed in Venice in 1553. It contains 5 model letters designed to serve as stylistic examples for students of this literary form. Many scholars have already noted that this is not a halachic work in any sense. It is a rhetorical manual, a linguistic primer, not a volume of responsa. Reb Baruch Epstein's description of it as a book of halachic questions and answers is simply inaccurate. The deeper question is, how did this extraordinarily rare volume printed in Venice some 3 centuries earlier come into Rayna Basia's hands? How did she know exactly what to look for in it? It's very difficult to imagine the Rebbetzin sitting in Volozhin simply happening upon such a rare volume on her husband's bookshelf. The scholar and researcher Rav Yehoshua Munshine proved, in a demonstration that precludes alternative explanations, that not only had Rayna Basia never laid eyes on the book, Rav Baruch Epstein himself had never seen it either. The relevant passage was published in the Hebrew newspaper Hatzvira on September 25, 1895, in a section called Tavlin, or Spice. The paper noted that in an old and ancient book, a letter had been found, worthy of publication on account of its views on women's education. The letter was quoted in the newspaper, but with certain key words omitted from the original. In the original, the passage reads, "Va'al chachmei doran la'adran lahadran l'sadran l'chazek yedehen u'la'amet zero'osehen l'chgar masnehen la'azar chaltzehen." The sages of their generation should glorify them, exalt them, support them, strengthen their hands, and brace their arms, gird their loins, tighten their belts. But in the newspaper, these last phrases about bracing their arms and girding their loins were omitted. Similarly, the original reads, "Umnam anashim asher nadva liban osana lekarva el hamelacha hamelucha meleches Hashem," but In the newspaper, the word melucha was omitted and only Meleches Hashem remained. And here's the remarkable thing. Rav Baruch Epstein's citation in Makar Baruch matches the newspaper version exactly with both of these omissions and not the original text of the book. There can be no doubt that Rav Epstein copied from the newspaper and that he never had the book in front of him. This also explains why he mistakenly described it as a book of halachic responsa, which he also did in Torah Tamima. And the newspaper, of course, was printed in 1895, years after Rayna Basia's death. So this episode never took place. Rayna Basia never held the book Mayan Ganim in her hands, never studied it, never exulted at its words, and certainly never confronted Rav Baruch Epstein over them. Rav Baruch himself learned of the relevant passage from reading Hatzfira, and he placed it in Rayna Basia's mouth. So if this story didn't happen, did anything happen at all? Is it possible that the conversations Rav Baruch Epstein recorded with such meticulous detail are in the end no more than beautiful literature? Rav Epstein was not only a Torah scholar, but a man of broad education and knowledge. It is possible that he was echoing arguments that circulated in his generation regarding the status of women in Judaism, arguments he placed as if the Rebbetzin had spoken them, staging himself as the young man, defending the traditional view against those who challenged it. Rav Baruch Epstein was born in 1860 and came to Volozhin at the age of 13. The exact date of Rebbetzin Rayna Basia's death is uncertain. The Encyclopedia Shel Hatzionut Hadatit marks her passing in 1871. But if that is correct, young Baruch, who was 11 at the time and had not yet arrived in Volozhin, never met her at all. On the basis of Rav Epstein's own account, the date of Rayna Basia's death would need to be pushed forward by several years. Even so, he was a very young man during his time in Volozhin, and it is genuinely difficult to know what degree of authenticity predominates in his narrative. And yet, all is not lost. Despite everything, it is very likely that there was a kernel of truth within the stories. Rav Epstein published his book at a time when people who had known the Rebbetzin were still alive. He could not have invented everything from whole cloth. The background is almost certainly accurate. The Rebbetzin was genuinely a seeker of knowledge, a lover of learning, with a fiery and independent intellectual capacity. How could it have been otherwise when she was the daughter of Rav Yitzchok Volozhiner and the wife of the Netziv? We know from other sources that Rav Yitzchok's daughters were distinguished for their wisdom. Everything beyond that, Rayna Basia's aspirations, her dreams, her inner life, we cannot know. Not yet, and perhaps not ever. It is reasonable to suppose that the Rebbetzins' personality, her intellect, her love of Torah, made a deep impression on the young Rav Baruch and planted within him a lasting doubt regarding the status and dignity of women in Jewish life at the time. At the same time, he also witnessed her physical frailty and her daily struggle to manage her household responsibilities. The internal conflict he experienced, he immortalized in the form of a dialogue between himself and his aunt, ensconcing his own perceptions and reflections on a woman's struggles, ambitions, and achievements. So now we take back Rayna Basia's story and remind ourselves and the world that we don't know what she actually said or what she truly felt. What we do know is that Rebbetzin Rayna Basia's brilliance and commitment to Torah were a matter of public record, and her support for Torah, her love of Torah, live on forever in her descendants and in the world she helped to fabricate. In honor of Shavuos, I will close with a beautiful interpretation offered by the Netziv himself, Rayna Basia's husband, on a pasuk from Shir Hashirim, Perek Beis, pasuk Hey. Samachuni ba'ashishos, raptuni batapuchim, ki cholas ahava ani. The usual interpretation of the pasuk is that the beloved is ailing, debilitated, sick because of love. She is so deeply immersed in her longing for HaKadosh Baruch Hu that she is unable to attend to anything else. But the Netziv, in his commentary, Rina Shel Torah, offers a strikingly different path. The prayer, he says, is the opposite. Ki cholas ahava ani, I am sick because I do not feel love toward you. I am ill because I am not reaching the wondrous pleasure, the rapture, that is love for Hashem. The Netziv, out of his own passionate love for Torah, is saying, one who does not feel love for Torah is sick. His emotions are blocked, and he needs to daven to Hashem to open his heart so that he too can experience that awe and that love. This episode is dedicated in honor of Chaya Bas Rezel L'Refuah Shalema. May the schus of this Eishes Chaver and the Torah she enabled and embodied bring refuos and yeshuos to everyone.
Thank you for listening to Veiled Reference. Enjoy this episode and share it with your friends. If you have questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, we'd love to hear from you at podcasts@mishpacha.com. Veiled Reference, a Mishpacha podcast.